Have you ever imagined having a child go missing? That must be one of the most terrifying events any parent can possibly go through. And to have it happen in an area where wild animals can kill him around just about every corner? Unimaginable. But that is exactly what happened to Edward and Clara Reed, the parents of 12-year-old Jason Reed, whose little exploring adventure turned into a 66-hour nightmare in the middle of the African bush, surrounded by animals that could kill him around every turn. This incident was both terrifying and heartwarming, so make sure you listen right to the end to experience all of the heart-stopping moments, as well as the relief and joy that this jaw-dropping, real-life story brings. The December sun hung high over the African savanna, its unrelenting heat shimmering off the golden grass that stretched out across the family farm. It was the 17th of December, smack in the middle of the rainy season. The Kruger National Park, teeming with life, extended seamlessly into the sprawling, family-owned land situated in an area known as the Timbavati. Now, for reference, the Timbavati Private Game Reserve had its origin in the 1950s when some 47 landowners established their idyllic game farms over an area of some 53,000 hectares, or in imperial terms, 380,000 acres. Then, in 1993, the fences between these farms and the Kruger National Park, a wildlife conservation area spanning some 19,600 square kilometers, or 7,600 square miles, started to come down. This allowed the wildlife from the park to freely roam through these previously fenced-off areas, which is the case to this day. Every creature, from the elusive leopard to the thundering elephant, can freely traverse the territory, making the farm as wild and untamed as the park itself. Jason Reed, a wiry 12-year-old with sun-bleached hair and a daring glint in his eye, bounded out of the farmhouse with an eager grin. The farm was his playground, an endless world of exploration and discovery. He had virtually grown up on this land, seeing that since his birth, his family used this farm as their place of escape, each chance they got. Every school holiday, most of Jason's friends made a beeline for the coast to spend their holiday by the sea, but Jason was at his happiest on their farm in the African bush. As always, Jason had his two steadfast companions by his side. Bubba, a 195-pound South African Boerboels with a massive head and a gaze that would send shivers down the spine of any intruder, always followed Jason's every movement. And Loula, the fearless female, though just a little smaller than Bubba, was every bit as protective and commanding. Bubba, the younger of the two, was almost like a shadow. He never let Jason out of his sight. His sheer size made him an intimidating presence, and his protective instincts ran deep. Loula, on the other hand, was the leader, a 4-year-old powerhouse who had chased off predators larger than herself without a second thought. Together, they made Jason feel invincible. As Jason walked away from the house, he glanced over his shoulder at his mother, who stood on the farmhouse porch, wiping her hands on a dishcloth, and shouted, "I'll be back." He carried a small rucksack with a bottle of water, a pocket knife, and a sandwich hastily wrapped in wax paper. He knew better than to stray too far from the house without the basics. The African bush was no playground for the careless. "Stay on the main path," she called back, worry tinging her voice. But Jason's mind was already elsewhere. He'd spotted a narrow, overgrown game trail a couple of days prior, a trail that practically begged to be explored. Today he would take it. Jason's trusty two companions sensed his excitement. Bubba's massive head nudged Jason's hand, his deep brown eyes watchful, while Loula trotted ahead, ears perked, her keen senses scanning the brush for any sign of danger. They ventured past the shed Jason's father used to process meat whenever they had been on a hunt, past the familiar landmarks of the farm, and toward the untamed wilderness that blurred the lines between the farm and the park. The family farm wasn't just a simple patch of land. It was a place where survival of the fittest played out every day. The top most dangerous animals roamed these plains: the lion, leopard, rhinoceros, elephant, Cape buffalo, hippo, and crocodile. Then there were the serpentine killers to also consider: the black mamba, boomslung, Mozambique spitting cobra, snouted cobra, and puff adder, each strike more deadly than the next. Other threats, like the unpredictability of a lone buffalo bull, the cunning of a hyena pack on the hunt, a pack of wild dogs, and the overwhelming heat that could sap a person's strength within hours, added to the danger. Yet, the thrill of adventure called louder than any warning. Jason pressed on, leading Bubba and Loula deeper into the bush. He felt the dry grass crunch under his boots, smelled the tang of wild sage in the air, and reveled in the freedom that came with being alone with nature. Time passed unnoticed. The sun climbed higher, baking the land in oppressive heat. Jason finished his water, but didn't think much of it. He would be back soon. Lula's bark interrupted his thoughts, her sharp tones slicing through the quiet afternoon. She stood tense, staring at a large marula tree that towered above them. "What is it, girl?" Jason asked, squinting at the thick branches. He saw nothing but leaves and shadow. Still, Lula's unease was contagious. Bubba stepped in front of Jason, his hackles raised. They'd wandered too far. The landscape looked different now, unfamiliar and unsettling. Jason turned, trying to find the path they'd followed, but every direction looked the same. Panic tightened his chest as he realized they were lost. "Come on, guys. Let's go back," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. He walked in what he thought was the right direction, but after 10 minutes, nothing seemed familiar. The dogs stuck close, their bodies tense, ears flicking at every sound. Jason's heart hammered as he spun around, confusion growing with each step. At this point, sweat started to pour down his face, and he constantly felt the urge to lick his dry lips. Jason also started to realize that he shouldn't have drunk all his water so quickly. The sun, now mercilessly baking the earth, seemed to sap his strength with every passing minute. "Mom's going to kill me," Jason whispered to himself, his throat parched. He glanced at his watch. Nearly 2 p.m. He'd been gone for hours. Jason needed to think, but his head felt like it was full of cotton. He turned again, but Lula's growl made him freeze. The dogs were standing side by side, staring into the dense underbrush. A low rustle, a flash of movement. Jason squinted, barely catching sight of the tall grass swaying unnaturally. His stomach clenched as a realization dawned on him. He and his 2 dogs were not alone. The Timbavati was coming alive around them, and not in a way that made Jason feel like a welcome visitor. Fear prickled along his spine, and he took a step back. Lula and Bubba moved with him, their bodies shielding him as they backed away. "Easy, boy. Easy, girl," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. The dog's eyes never left the spot in the bushes. The game had changed. The thrill of adventure turned into something darker, more primal. He was just a boy, lost in the heart of the wilderness, surrounded by unseen predators, with only 2 loyal companions standing between him and whatever lurked in the shadows. Jason swallowed hard, gripping Bubba's thick pelt for comfort. He had to get back. He had to stay calm. But deep down he knew the bush had no mercy for the lost or the weak. Jason's breath hitched as the oppressive silence pressed down on them. The rustling in the brush had ceased, leaving only the steady thud of his heartbeat reverberating in his ears. The boy's eyes darted nervously, searching for any sign of movement, but the thick wall of leaves and branches revealed nothing. Bubba stood rigid beside him, his massive chest expanding and contracting with each deep breath, while Lula edged forward, hackles raised and teeth bared. "What is it?" Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. He knew the dogs wouldn't react this way unless there was something dangerous nearby. As if in answer, the dense bush stirred again. Jason felt his legs lock in place. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but where would he go? He didn't even know which direction was home anymore. Lula's lips curled back, exposing sharp teeth. Then suddenly, a pair of eyes, yellow and unblinking, emerged from the shadows. The animal stepped forward, and Jason's heart plummeted into his stomach. A hyena. Its coat, matted and spotted, blended seamlessly with the tall grass. Its gaze shifted between the 2 dogs and Jason, calculating, hungry. Jason had seen hyenas before, but always from the safety of the farmhouse or inside a vehicle. Never like this. Never so close that he could hear the rumble of its breathing or smell its rank odor. The hyena laughed, a high-pitched cackle that sent shivers down Jason's spine. It was alone, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. Hyenas are renowned for being extremely capable hunters. An adult female like this could crush bone with a single bite. Lula barked sharply, a fierce, guttural sound that reverberated through the stillness. The hyena hesitated, taken aback by her aggression. Bubba joined in, his deep, booming bark carrying a weight of authority that made the hyena shrink back, its lips twitching nervously. "Go away!" Jason yelled as loud as he could, his voice breaking. He waved his arms, trying to appear bigger, but his movements were stiff and uncoordinated. The hyena regarded him with an almost mocking gaze before turning its focus back on the dogs. Lula snapped at the air, taking a few threatening steps forward. The hyena backed off, then bolted, its lanky frame disappearing into the bush. Jason watched it vanish, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The relief that followed was fleeting. A solitary hyena might retreat, but a pack would be a different story altogether. They needed to find shelter, and fast. Jason turned slowly, scanning the surrounding landscape for any recognizable features, but the scenery remained unfamiliar. The golden hues of the grass were tinged with the deepening reds and purples of dusk, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. "We need to find a safe spot fast," he murmured, patting Bubba's thick neck. Lula stayed ahead, her head turning sharply at every sound. As night fell, the bush became alive with activity. Bush babies calling, insects buzzing, and far off in the distance, the faint, haunting roar of a lion. Jason's throat tightened. He'd seen lions on the farm before, majestic creatures that strolled through like they owned the place. But the thought of facing one on foot in the dark made his skin crawl. The top predators of Kruger moved under the cover of night, hunting in the shadows. He wasn't ready for that. Not even close. They walked for what felt like hours. Every step drained Jason's strength, his mouth dry and throat raw from thirst. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his muscles aching. Finally, Loula stopped near a cluster of rocks at the base of a kopje, a small rocky hill that jutted out of the flat landscape. It wasn't much, but it would offer some cover. Jason climbed onto a gap between two of the larger boulders and sank down, his legs trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. He pulled his knees to his chest and rested his forehead on them, struggling to hold back tears. He was scared. Scared of the dark, scared of the noises, scared of the fact that he didn't know how to get home. The dogs settled on either side of him, their heavy bodies pressing close. Bubba leaned against Jason's shoulder, his presence comforting and solid. Loula lay with her head up, ears pricked, eyes scanning the dark bush around them. "I'm sorry, guys," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Overhead, a mass of stars twinkling in the clear. The temperature dropped, and a cool breeze swept through the grasses, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down Jason's spine. What would otherwise have been a welcome relief from the intense heat of the day now felt uncomfortably cold against Jason's body, possibly due to the dehydration he was suffering from not having anything to drink since his water bottle ran out. He hugged his arms around himself, his fingers starting to go numb from the chill. Then suddenly, a guttural purr split the night, a sound so raw and intense that it made Jason's blood turn to ice. Loula leapt to her feet, barking furiously. Jason's heart pounded against his ribs as he strained to see through the darkness. There, on the edge of their makeshift camp, the silhouette of a massive animal moved through the shadows. Jason squinted, trying to make out its shape. It was broad, with a muscular frame and short, powerful legs. A leopard. Jason's breath came in short gasps as he watched a huge leopard stroll into the bush, moving away from them at a slight angle. Leopards were the ultimate silent hunters, stealthy and lethal. And had it not been for Loula and Bubba's presence, this one would, in all probability, have attacked and killed him as he walked up to the boulders before he would even have been able to realize what was happening. Nevertheless, Jason instinctively scrambled backward at the sight of the creature, his heart racing. It took the young boy a good moment to realize that the leopard had no interest in trying its luck with two fierce-looking, unfamiliar animals that looked like they could injure it, and in all probability sign its death sentence. An injured leopard cannot hunt, and a leopard that cannot hunt cannot eat. So to this particular leopard, the reward in all probability simply did not justify the risk it perceived in getting it. However, despite the leopard clearly showing no interest in them, Loula still lunged, barking and snapping with ferocious intensity. Bubba followed suit, a wall of muscle and fury. The leopard stopped and hesitated for a moment, eyes narrowing, and then, with a final growl, it turned and melted back into the darkness. Jason exhaled shakily, his body trembling. "Good job, Loula. Good job, Bubba," he whispered, reaching out to touch them, feeling the warmth of their bodies beneath his trembling hands. The night stretched on, filled with unsettling noises. Frequent and scary footsteps in the brush, the cries of nocturnal animals, the distant roar of lions. Jason kept his eyes open, sleep eluding him as fear anchored him to the present. Loula and Bubba remained vigilant, their eyes shining in the faint starlight. Every creak, every whisper of movement sent Jason's heart racing. Time crawled. Each minute felt to him like an eternity. He thought of his mother, of how worried she must be. He thought of his father's advice he often offered, for no apparent reason. Stay calm, stay smart. But it was hard to be calm when the darkness seemed to pulse with danger, like it did in each and every moment. Then, just as he felt himself starting to doze, a new sound reached his ears. A deep, rumbling grunt. Jason's eyes snapped open. He craned his neck, searching the shadows. There, emerging from the brush, a hulking, shadowy figure loomed in the darkness. The massive frame, the curved horns. It was a buffalo bull, one of the most dangerous animals in the park. Jason's blood ran cold as the beast snorted, pawing the ground. "Bubba, Loula, easy!" Jason whispered, his voice shaking. The bull tossed its head, eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. It took a step forward, its bulk crushing the dry grass beneath it. Loula growled low in her throat, but didn't move. Bubba stiffened, his eyes on the buffalo. Jason held his breath. One wrong move, one sudden sound, and the bull could charge. A buffalo's charge was like a freight train, unstoppable and deadly. He'd heard stories of how they trampled and gored people to death, leaving nothing but broken bones and blood in their wake. The buffalo stared at them for what felt like hours, steam puffing from its nostrils. Then with a final snort, it turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the night. Jason released a shaky breath, his hands trembling. He glanced at the dogs, their eyes never leaving the spot where the buffalo had stood. "We made it, guys," he whispered, more to reassure himself than them. At this point, he really started to doubt whether he was going to survive this ordeal long enough to either find his way back or for someone to find him. But deep down, Jason knew this was only the beginning. The night still held countless threats, and dawn was a long way off. With Loula and Bubba by his side, he huddled on the rock, praying that they could survive until... The night dragged on for what seemed to Jason like an eternity, but eventually the next morning arrived. The sun rose slowly over the African bush, casting long shadows across the dry landscape. The sky shifted from deep purple to fiery orange, and the first light of dawn spilled over the kopje where Jason, Bubba, and Loula had spent the night. Jason's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, the restless hours of darkness still lingering in his mind. Every rustle, every unseen movement, every glimmer of light reflecting off an eye had kept him on edge. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Not with beasts like the leopard and the buffalo roaming so close. His body ached from tension, his mouth dry and his throat parched. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, and glanced at the dogs. Bubba's head was resting on his massive paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Loula, ever vigilant, remained standing, her gaze sweeping over the terrain below. "Good morning, girl," Jason whispered, his voice hoarse. Lula's ears perked up at his words, and she nudged his leg gently as if to say, "We've got this." He offered a faint smile and reached out to stroke her head. The air was cooler now, a refreshing breeze rustling the tall grass. But Jason knew it wouldn't last. By mid-morning, the relentless heat would return, baking the earth and draining whatever strength he had left. He looked at his empty water bottle and sighed. He needed water, desperately. Dehydration was setting in fast, and in this heat, he might not last long without it. "Okay, Bubba, Loula, we need to find water," he murmured, pushing himself to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he steadied himself with a deep breath. The dogs rose with him, their bodies tense and ready. They had deterred a leopard from showing them too much interest and stared down a buffalo bull. They were the only reason Jason was still alive. Jason glanced around, trying to get his bearings. Everything looked different in the daylight, but still, nothing seemed familiar. The overgrown trail they had followed yesterday was nowhere to be seen, swallowed up by the vast expanse of grass and bush. His heart sank. "Think, Jason, think," he muttered to himself, scanning the horizon. There was no smoke to indicate the location of a house, no sound of vehicles, no familiar trees or landmarks. The feeling of being lost washed over him again, a wave of panic that tightened his chest. But he forced himself to stay calm. His father's words constantly echoed in his mind. Stay calm, stay smart. He took a deep breath and focused. If he couldn't find his way back, he would find water first. Water meant life. He knew that wildlife often gathered near water sources early in the morning and late in the afternoon, and that birds would flock to them throughout the day. "Come on, let's go," he whispered to his two trusty companions. He picked a direction that seemed slightly downhill and started walking, his boots crunching on the dry ground. Bubba and Loula followed closely, their bodies pressed against his legs as if they sensed his fear. They trekked through the bush for what felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, its rays growing stronger. Sweat beaded on Jason's forehead, his shirt sticking to his skin. He stumbled over rocks and roots, pushing through the thick underbrush. Thorns scratched his arms and branches slapped his face. His throat burned with thirst, his mouth dry as sand. Every step took more effort, his legs growing weaker. He glanced at Bubba, who looked back at him with concern. Loula trotted ahead, pausing every now and then to sniff the air. Jason's heart lifted when she darted forward and barked excitedly. "Loula, what is it, girl?" Jason hurried after her, his pulse quickening. She led him to a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly. Jason's eyes widened in hope as he spotted a narrow stream cutting through the earth. It was little more than a trickle, but it was water. "Good girl, Loula." Jason dropped to his knees beside the stream and cupped his hands, scooping up the cool, clear liquid. He drank greedily, the water washing away the dryness in his throat. He didn't care about the gritty taste or the tiny flecks of dirt floating in it. It was life. He filled his bottle, and the dogs lapped at the stream, tongues splashing in the shallow water. Jason felt a surge of energy as he drank, his strength returning. He sat back on his heels, watching the dogs drink. For the first time since they'd gotten lost, he felt a sliver of hope. With water, they could survive a bit longer, maybe find food, maybe find their way back. But the relief was short-lived. A sharp crack rang out across the clearing, followed by a low, rumbling growl. Jason froze, eyes darting around. Loula stiffened, her ears flattening. Bubba growled, his gaze fixed on the opposite bank of the stream. Slowly, Jason turned his head, and his heart dropped. A massive crocodile lay half-submerged in the muddy water, its armored body blending in with the murky bank. Its jaws were slightly open, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The crocodile's unblinking eyes were locked on Bubba. "Bubba, get back," Jason whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. He grabbed Bubba's collar, pulling him away. The crocodile didn't move, but its tail twitched slightly, sending ripples across the water's surface. The crocodile was far enough away from them not to pose a threat, but Jason's stomach churned with fear at the thought that one of his beloved dogs might charge it and get killed. They had wandered right into its territory. He could see it now, the faint drag marks in the mud, the flattened reeds where it had basked in the sun. It was big, easily 5 times the size of Bubba, and more powerful than anything Jason could imagine. Also, in the back of his mind, a little voice nagged at him. It's not the ones you can see that kill you. It's the ones that you don't see. He took a slow step back, his hand gripping Bubba's collar. Loula moved with them, her eyes never leaving the crocodile. The massive reptile watched them retreat, its eyes narrowing. Jason's heart pounded as he backed away, careful not to trip. Just a few more steps. Suddenly the crocodile lunged, its jaws snapping shut with a bone-chilling crack. Jason stumbled backward, yanking Bubba with him. Loula barked furiously, baring her teeth. The crocodile slipped into the far side of the pond that the stream they had been drinking from fed into with deceiving speed that appeared as if it was moving in slow motion, but it was not. "Let's go!" Jason shouted, scrambling to get up the slight embankment along the side of the stream. He didn't look back as he bolted, Bubba and Loula at his heels. They crashed through the underbrush, branches slapping at them as they ran. Jason's lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop until they were a good 100 yards away. He collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. Bubba and Loula flanked him, panting heavily. Jason's hands shook as he clutched the water bottle, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Close. Too close, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced at the dogs, who were watching him intently, their eyes wide with concern. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. They had water now, but they couldn't stay near the stream, not with predators like that around. "Come on," he said softly, standing up on shaky legs. "We'll keep moving. We'll find somewhere safe." They started walking again, heading away from the stream and into the thicker bush. Jason felt the sun beating down on him, the heat growing more intense with every passing minute. The dogs panted heavily, their tongues lolling out. Jason tried not to think about how far they still had to go, or the fact that he had no idea which direction was the right one. The morning stretched into the afternoon. Jason stumbled more often now, his legs heavy, his head pounding. Every sound made him jump. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see a predator of some sorts slithering through the grass, or worse, a lion. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long, ominous shadows across the bush. After having walked aimlessly for hours, Jason went and sat against the rough bark of a marula tree, his face flushed with heat and pain. He glanced at Bubba and Loula, who lay beside him, panting softly. Their loyalty and courage had been nothing short of miraculous. They had stood by him, protected him, and now they watched over him as he toyed with the idea of just giving up. But the respite was brief. He knew they couldn't linger here. The sun's rays were beginning to wane, and with darkness came a whole new set of dangers. The African bush at night is a world ruled by predators, stealthy hunters that prowl under the cover of darkness, looking for prey. And Jason, weakened and exposed, was a prime and all too easy target. "Come on, guys," he whispered, pushing himself up with a grimace. His muscles ached, his skin stinging with every movement. But he couldn't afford to stop. "We have to keep moving. We need to find shelter before it gets too dark," Jason mumbled. Loula got up off the ground first, shaking herself off as if casting away her own exhaustion. Bubba lumbered to his feet next, his massive frame brushing against Jason's leg for support. Jason took a deep breath and looked around, searching for any sign of safety. The land stretched out before them, a sea of dry grass and thorny bushes. Rocky outcrops dotted the landscape, and Jason's eyes settled on a narrow ravine that cut through a nearby hill. It wasn't much, but it would offer some cover from the wind and a vantage point to spot approaching predators. "Let's try over there," Jason said, pointing to the ravine. He trudged forward, each step a battle against his body's protests. Bubba and Loula moved with him, their senses alert. Jason's pulse quickened as he noticed the shift in their posture. Ears pricked, noses twitching. They were on edge, and that could only mean danger. They reached the ravine just as the last light of day faded into twilight. Jason squeezed between the rocks, pulling himself into a narrow crevice that formed a natural alcove. The walls rose on either side, giving a sense of protection, though it was far from safe. He sat back, panting heavily, and glanced at the dogs. Bubba settled down beside him, his huge body blocking most of the entrance, while Loula positioned herself on the opposite side, her gaze scanning the darkness beyond. "Good job, guys," Jason murmured, reaching out to pat their heads. The dog's presence was a huge comfort, their warm bodies a reminder that he wasn't alone in this hostile wilderness. The night descended quickly, enveloping them in a thick, suffocating darkness. The stars blinked into existence above, millions of tiny pinpricks of light scattered across the black sky. The air was still, the silence oppressive. Jason strained his ears, listening for any sound, any indication that they were not alone. And then, the first distant roar echoed through the night. Jason's heart skipped a beat. It was deep and rumbling, a sound that vibrated through his bones. He knew that roar. It was a lion, somewhere out in the bush. Ironically, this is the sound he most loved to hear at night, while lying safely in his bed in their house on the farm. Now, his breath hitched as he glanced at Bubba, who had lifted his head, ears flat against his skull. Lula's hackles rose, and she bared her teeth in a silent snarl. Jason swallowed hard, his mouth dry with fear. Lions were the apex predators of the savannah, and they ruled the night with an iron grip. He shifted, trying to make himself as small as possible in the cramped space. "Stay quiet, stay still," he whispered to the dogs, his voice trembling. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, his skin crawling with the prickling sensation of being watched. The lion's roar came again, closer this time. Jason's eyes widened, straining to see into the darkness. He could make out vague shapes. The twisted branches of acacia trees, the flickering shadows of the underbrush. The next hour and a half was pure torture. The roaring had gone quiet, but the fear skyrocketed. Jason's father had taught him that the roaring was to get the pride to move, to get ready for the night's hunting. And then when they went quiet, the hunt had commenced. He more than once convinced himself he could see the shape of a lion stalking him between the underbrush and the darkness. Then, in the not-so-far distance, a bellow rang out. It was the unmistakable cries from a buffalo that had been caught by a pride of lions. On some level, it was terrifying, but on another, Jason knew he could relax to a certain extent. If the pride took down a buffalo, it would keep them occupied for the rest of the night, which means they would not be a threat to him and his two dogs, and they would be safe from them at least till daybreak. As the night wore on, Jason lay there listening to the growls and snarls as the lions ate and fought among each other for the best eating positions. The first light of dawn of Jason's third day lost in the bush crept over the horizon, casting a soft pink glow across the landscape. Jason stumbled along, his limbs aching and his eyes gritty with exhaustion. As always, Bubba and Loula flanked him, their heads low but their bodies still vigilant. He didn't know how much longer he could go on, but the promise of daylight gave Jason a sliver of hope. His lips were cracked and his tongue felt thick and dry in his mouth. Thirst gnawed at him. Every step was an agonizing reminder of how desperate their situation had become. They needed water. Badly. Without it, they wouldn't last much longer under the relentless African sun. But there was none in sight, only the arid landscape stretching out endlessly around them. "Come on, we can do this," Jason muttered, more to himself than to the dogs. His voice sounded small and raspy, lost in the vast emptiness of the bush. He glanced at Bubba and Loula, their pelts matted with dirt and dust. Yet their eyes remained sharp, scanning the terrain for any sign of danger or, hopefully, salvation. They trudged on, the heat rising steadily. Sweat beaded on Jason's forehead, soaking through his shirt, but he had no energy to wipe it away. At one point, he stumbled over a rock, almost falling, but Bubba's solid frame caught him. Jason leaned against the dog for support, his chest heaving. "Good boy," he whispered, patting Bubba's head. The dog's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. Jason swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand on his own. They had to keep moving. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Jason squinted against the harsh light, his head throbbing. His vision blurred at the edges, and he blinked rapidly, trying to clear it. He couldn't afford to pass out. He instinctively knew if he did, that would be the end of him. The scavengers and predators that roamed the bush would be onto him in no time, and eventually his two beloved dogs would also fall prey. Suddenly, Lula's ears perked up. She sniffed the air, her tail wagging slightly. Jason frowned, following her gaze. In the distance, shimmering like a mirage in the heat, was a narrow band of green. The unmistakable sight of vegetation clustered along a riverbed. "Water," Jason breathed, his heart leaping with hope. "There has got to be water there." Renewed energy surged through him, and he quickened his pace, the dogs trotting beside him. The ground sloped gently downward, leading them toward the riverbed. As they drew closer, the dry, cracked earth gave way to softer, more fertile soil. The air felt cooler, the oppressive heat easing just a fraction. Jason stumbled to the edge of the riverbed, his breath catching in his throat. The sight that greeted him was both a relief and a frustration. There was no flowing river, just a series of shallow, muddy pools scattered along the sandy bed. But it was water nonetheless, and Jason fell to his knees beside the nearest pool. He cupped his hands, scooping up the murky liquid. It was warm and tasted of dirt and animal dung, but he didn't care. He drank greedily, the water soothing the burning dryness in his throat. Bubba and Loula lapped at the water too, their tongues flicking rapidly as they drank their fill. Jason sat back, gasping for breath. The water wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the sparse vegetation and the trickle of green that marked the path of the dried-up riverbed. It was a good place to rest. At least for a while, Jason thought to himself. They needed to regain their strength if they were going to make it out of here. He leaned back against a smooth rock, his body sagging with exhaustion. The dogs settled beside him, their sides heaving as they rested. Jason closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the bush wash over him. For the first time in quite a while, he noticed the sound of birds calling all around them. It was kind of serene, reminding him of their farmhouse he wished he could find now more than ever. They had survived another night and they had found water. It wasn't much, but it was something. He opened his eyes and glanced around, trying to gauge their location. The riverbed seemed familiar, a place he might have visited with his father before. If he could figure out where they were, maybe he could find the way back to the farm. Think, Jason, he murmured, furrowing his brow. His mind felt sluggish, weighed down by exhaustion and pain, but he forced himself to focus. He pictured the layout of the farm, the way the river snaked through the property, connecting to the main water sources that supplied the animals. If they could follow the riverbed upstream, they might come across one of the larger water holes, the ones where he and his parents often went to watch the animals come for a drink late in the afternoon. From there, it would be easier to find a familiar path. Jason looked down at the dogs. Bubba was licking his paws and Loula had her head on hers, eyes half closed, but still watchful. They looked as weary as he felt, but he knew they wouldn't stop. They would follow him wherever he led. Okay, let's do this, he said softly, pushing himself to his feet. His muscles protested, but he ignored the pain. We're going home. He took a deep breath and began to walk along the riverbed, Bubba and Loula falling into step beside him. The sun was still high, with its heat pressing down on them, but they kept moving, driven by the promise of safety and the thought of home. Hours seemed to blur together as they trudged along the winding riverbed. Jason's vision swam, his head pounding. He stumbled often, his body growing weaker with each passing minute, but he refused to stop. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take another step, he saw it. A flash of white in the distance, stark against the green of the trees. Jason's 12-year-old heart skipped a beat as he squinted, trying to make it out. It was a water pump, its metal structure glinting in the sunlight. Jason let out a choked sob of relief. The pump belonged to his father, who had the borehole drilled years ago to provide a source of water for the animals in the vicinity during those extra dry years on the farm. They were close, very close. We did it, guys, Jason whispered, tears stinging his eyes. We're almost home, Bubba barked softly, his tail wagging weakly. Loula nuzzled Jason's leg, her eyes bright with understanding. They pushed on, the water pump growing larger with each step. Little did Jason know that this experience would test his resolve just a little further before he would see his mom and dad again. As they entered the small clearing that surrounded the borehole, Jason stared at the water pump, his breath catching in his throat. It felt almost surreal. They had found the first familiar sign of civilization, but they were far from safe. The treacherous path they'd followed meant they were still a considerable distance from the farmhouse. Jason's stomach clenched at the thought of having to spend another night out in the open. Okay, just one more push, Jason whispered, his voice trembling. He reached out and grasped the rusted handle of the pump, praying there was still water left in its reserves. He pumped furiously, his hands slipping on the slick metal as he fought against his own desperation. At first, only a faint creaking filled the air. But then a sputter. A thin stream of clear water gushed out. Bubba and Loula immediately pressed their snouts to the small pool forming below, lapping eagerly. Jason followed suit, gulping down the fresh, cool water, his entire body trembling with relief. He let out a sigh and sat back on his heels, the damp soil cooling his legs. However, the sun was starting to make its way over the edge of the horizon already, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. He glanced at Bubba and Loula. Both looked more alert after the drink, their eyes reflecting the dying light with an unsettling intensity. Jason forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly. We have to keep moving, he murmured, his gaze shifting nervously to the thickening shadows. He knew what lurked out there. He'd heard the stories, seen the aftermath of predator attacks, most notably one incident where poachers were killed and partially devoured by a pride of lions. This part of the bush was known for its large populations of nocturnal hunters. They moved in silence, Jason leading the way with Bubba and Loula at his sides. The air cooled rapidly, and a chorus of nighttime sounds erupted around them again. Every sound set Jason's heart racing, his ears straining for anything out of place. The dogs, too, were on high alert, their ears pricked and noses twitching as they scented the breeze. They wove their way through the dense undergrowth, following a narrow game trail that twisted and turned unpredictably. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches entwining above, casting a web of shadows across the path. Jason stumbled often, his fatigue weighing down every step, but he kept going, driven by sheer willpower. Then a low, guttural, purr-like growl rumbled through the air. Jason froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Lula's hackles rose, a deep snarl escaping her throat. Bubba stepped forward, positioning himself protectively between Jason and the source of the sound. Jason's eyes darted around, searching the darkness. He could see nothing, but he could feel it. Something was watching them. A sudden movement caught his eye. A pair of glowing yellow eyes stared back at him from the underbrush, unblinking and predatory. Jason's blood ran cold. Another leopard. He recognized the sleek, muscular form, the way it crouched low, coiled like a spring ready to explode. The leopard's gaze was fixed on them, its body tense with intent. It is very rare for a leopard to see a human as a prey item, but leopards are notorious for attacking humans rather savagely if they are surprised and feel threatened. Quite often, the leopard would lie in hiding and just watch humans walk by without them even knowing it's there. But get too close and make it feel threatened, and you are in for a world of hurt. "Easy, boy," Jason whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. He reached down, his hand brushing against Bubba's shoulder. The dog's muscles were taut, vibrating with barely restrained aggression. Loula growled again, her lips peeling back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. For an excruciatingly long moment, Jason, Bubba, Loula, and the leopard faced each other, locked in a deadly standoff. Jason's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he knew that if he did that, it would be like dragging a clump of wool past a house cat lying on the kitchen floor. The leopard would pounce almost immediately, and at the distance they were apart, reach him in less than 2 seconds. Slowly, Jason began to back away, his eyes never leaving the leopard. Bubba and Loula mirrored his movements, their growls steady and menacing. The leopard hissed softly, its ears flattening against its skull. Then, Loula did something unexpected. She lunged forward, barking furiously, her voice echoing through the bush like a cannon blast. The leopard flinched, startled by the sudden aggression. Bubba joined in, his deep, booming barks reverberating through the trees. The leopard hesitated, its body quivering with indecision. And then, with a final guttural snarl, it turned and slunk back into the shadows, its eyes disappearing into the darkness. Jason exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling. "Good girl, Loula. Good boy, Bubba," he whispered, his voice thick with relief. He dropped to his knees, his legs unable to support him any longer. The dogs pressed close, their warm bodies a comforting presence against his. But there was no time to rest. Not here, not so close to danger. Leopards are fiercely territorial, and this leopard will most certainly be in the area for the rest of the night, if not tomorrow also. Jason needed to put some distance between where they saw the animal and them in the opposite direction from that in which the leopard ran off. Jason was still frozen in the same spot where he collapsed after Loula lunged. He cast one last look at the darkness where the leopard had disappeared before turning away. His nerves were frayed, his body ached, and his mind was clouded with fatigue, but he couldn't stop. They had made it through 2 nights in this unforgiving wilderness, and he couldn't afford to falter now, not when they were so close to meeting back up with his mom and dad. That night seemed particularly endless, a blur of twisted shadows and distant haunting sounds. Jason and his 2 dogs did something not even seasoned rangers would dare to ever do: walk through the bush that teemed with deadly predators and other dangerous animals at night. But then finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jason saw it, a faint flickering light in the distance. He blinked, not daring to believe it at first. But as they drew closer, the light grew brighter, steadier. It was the security light on the front porch of their house, his house. "We made it," Jason whispered, tears of exhaustion and relief spilling down his cheeks. Bubba nudged his leg, a low whine escaping him. Loula licked Jason's hand, her tail wagging slowly. They crested the final hill, and there it was, the farmhouse, silhouetted against the starry sky. Jason stood at the top of the hill, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his eyes fixed on the site of his family holiday home. "We're here," he whispered, his voice breaking. He looked down at Bubba and Loula, their sides heaving with fatigue, but their eyes still bright and focused. There's no mistaking that the dogs had been his lifeline, protecting him, guiding him, keeping him from giving up when the bush threatened to swallow him whole. Jason took a shaky breath and started down the hill, his movements slow and deliberate. Every step felt like a monumental effort, his muscles protesting with every shift of weight. The dogs stayed close, their ears twitching as they scanned the surroundings for any remaining threats. As they approached the house, the soft creak of the front door made Jason's heart leap into his throat. He looked up, squinting against the glare of a flashlight. The beam of light swept across the yard, searching, then stopped abruptly when it landed on him. "Jason, is that you?" The voice was a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Jason's father, Edward, stood on the porch, the flashlight trembling in his hands. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, separated by a few yards and 3 days of fear and uncertainty. "Dad!" Jason croaked, his voice barely audible. He took a stumbling step forward, and then another. The flashlight dropped to the ground as Edward raced down the porch steps, his boots pounding against the wooden planks. In an instant, Edward's arms were around Jason, pulling him close. Jason buried his face in his father's chest, the scent of sweat and soil mingling with the familiar smell of home. He felt his father's body shake, heard the strangled sobs as Edward clutched him as if afraid he might disappear. "I thought I'd lost you, son. I thought—" Edward choked, unable to finish the sentence. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching Jason's face, taking in every scratch, bruise, and streak of dirt. "It's okay, Dad. I'm okay," Jason murmured, his voice muffled against his father's shirt. He glanced back at Bubba and Loula, who stood a few paces behind, watching the reunion with wagging tails and proud, alert stances. "They kept me safe, Dad. Bubba and Loula. They saved me." Edward looked at the dogs, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Good dogs. You're good dogs," he whispered hoarsely, dropping to one knee and extending a hand. Bubba and Loula moved forward, pressing their heads against him, their bodies leaning into the touch as if to confirm they, too, were finally home. "We need to get you inside. Get some water, get you checked out," Edward said, standing and gently guiding Jason toward the house. The porch light cast a warm, comforting glow over the yard, and Jason blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust after days in the harsh sunlight and pitch-black nights. As they reached the front steps, Jason hesitated, his gaze shifting to the distant bush. "There's a dried-up riverbed. We followed it. If we trace it back, it should lead to where I got lost," he said slowly, his mind replaying the winding path through the undergrowth. "We'll worry about that later. Right now, the only thing that matters is that you're safe." The door swung open, and Jason's mother, Clara, appeared, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes widened as she saw Jason, and then she was there, wrapping her arms around him in a tight, desperate embrace. "Oh, Jason, I was so scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Mom," Jason murmured, resting his head against her shoulder. "I didn't mean to." "Shh, it's not your fault. You're home now. That's all that matters," she whispered, smoothing his hair back gently. She looked over his shoulder at Edward, who gave a slight nod. Clara released Jason and stepped back, her gaze lingering on him as if reassuring herself that he was really there. Edward led them inside, and Jason collapsed into the couch, his entire body sagging with exhaustion. Clara rushed to the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of water and a plate of freshly baked bread. Jason drank slowly, savoring each cool sip as if it were the finest nectar. The bread crumbled in his hands, but he ate hungrily, his body crying out for nourishment. Bubba and Loula settled at his feet, their massive forms sprawling across the floor. Jason reached down, his fingers brushing through their fur. "You did good, guys. You did real good," he murmured softly. The dogs responded with contented sighs, their eyes closing as they drifted into sleep. Edward sat beside him, his hand resting on Jason's shoulder. "You were brave, son. Braver than I can even imagine." Jason glanced up, meeting his father's gaze. I wanted to come home." Edward nodded, his eyes misting again. "And you did. You made it back, Jason. You made it back." Outside, the first hints of dawn began to brighten the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the farm. The shadows of the night retreated, leaving behind only the peaceful silence of a new day. They had survived. Together, they had found their way back to safety, back to family, back to home. Jason slumped back into the couch, his body feeling heavier with each passing moment. The comfort of the familiar surroundings, his mother's soft humming as she busied herself in the kitchen, the quiet ticking of the old wall clock, brought a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. For the first time since getting lost, his mind began to truly unwind, the tension slowly melting away. He looked at Bubba and Loula, who were sprawled out on the wooden floor, their sides rising and falling in the deep rhythm of sleep. They had fought for him, and guided him through the unforgiving wilderness without hesitation, 100% committed to give their own lives to protect him. They're human. He reached down to pat their heads softly, feeling a surge of gratitude and love for his companions. Then suddenly the sound of a car engine rumbled outside, and Jason's head jerked up, momentarily startled. He turned toward the window and saw a familiar Land Rover pulling up the driveway. Two uniformed men stepped out. It was Ranger Chaka and his colleague Solomon, both seasoned Kruger National Park officials who had known Jason since he was a toddler. The men moved quickly toward the porch, their expressions taut with urgency. Jason's father stepped outside to meet them, and though Jason couldn't hear the conversation, he could see the relief etched on their faces when Edward gestured toward the house. Chaka's eyes softened, and he let out a visible sigh, his shoulders sagging
Jason, you
slightly.
gave us all the biggest scare ever, boy. I didn't mean to, I just wanted to explore. A true adventurer's spirit, just like your old man. But you've got to be more careful, lad. This bush isn't kind to those who wander too far. It's good to see you back in one piece, Jason. We've been combing these hills and valleys for days. To be honest, we started to think that we wouldn't find you alive, truth be told. In fact, right now, there are 17 desperate buggers out there still looking for you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause trouble. Jason took a deep breath and began recounting everything. The game trail he'd followed, the abandoned riverbed they'd stumbled upon, the predator encounters, and how Bubba and Loula had fought to protect him from each and every danger they faced. As he spoke, the men listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances. Jason's mom just sat there, listening intently, with her hand covering her mouth in shock and horror. When he described how Loula had charged at the leopard on the last evening and chased it off, Chaka's eyes widened. Boerboels, huh? I've always known they were tough, but this... He glanced at the dogs, admiration clear in his gaze. They've got hearts as big as their bodies. Jason nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, they do. I don't know what I would have done without them. Solomon leaned forward, his brow furrowed thoughtfully. You said you followed a dry riverbed? That could mean a water source nearby. With this drought, the animals will be migrating closer to it, which means predators will follow. You were right in the thick of it, Jason. You are a very fortunate boy that these two beasts had your back. Jason glanced at his father, who gave a nod. That's true. They always stick to Jason like glue, and what a blessing that turned out to be, his father said with a smile that reflected both satisfaction and enormous relief. Chaka stood, his demeanor shifting back to that of a ranger with a mission. We're just grateful you made it home safe, Jason. You had so many people frantic over your disappearance. Everyone will be elated to learn the good news. He softened his gaze, giving Jason a reassuring smile. Get some rest, son. You've earned it. Jason nodded, exhaustion pulling him under. The past 3 days were catching up to him in a tidal wave of fatigue. He glanced at the two dogs again. Can they stay with me? Of course, his mother said softly, kneeling beside him and brushing his hair back gently. They're not going anywhere. Neither are you. People often claim that these South African Mastiffs are so protective over their humans that they will gladly give up their own lives to protect them. This must be one of the most stellar examples of just that. Do you think Jason's parents were negligent to let him roam around the property that is open to some of the most deadly predators and animals on the planet? Or do you think it's a part of letting boys be boys? In one of our previous stories on the channel, we covered the near-death experience a female tourist had in Botswana when she was bitten by a black mamba. These snakes are common in the Timbavati. Had Jason been bitten by one of them, even a couple of yards from the house, the time it would take to get to a hospital would probably mean he wouldn't make it. You let us know in the comments. Would you feel comfortable letting your kids vacation here? And finally, don't leave us lost in the YouTube wilderness. Hit like and subscribe and guide this channel back home. Much love and stay safe.